Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options. Today, we're going to be talking about storytelling. Now, because of his storytelling work at NASA, I've invited Ed Hoffman to join me as my co host. And Ed, I'm going to bring you in. So happy to have you back on the stage with me.
Always good to be back with you, Madeline, and particularly around stories. I think that's how we first got on the stage together.
Absolutely. Well, our guest today is Svend-Erik Engh, and I'm going to bring him on and then tell you all about him. And there he is in the middle of the screen. I've met Svend-Erik Engh when he joined the Golden Fleece International Conference on Storytelling and Business back in the early 2000s. Now, that was in Washington, D.C. We did that conference for about 10 years. And I think, Svend-Erik, you were there almost every year, as I recall. But what was really neat was that he brought the qualities of the ancient tradition of European storytelling to our audiences. And then, and this is really cool, then he had a conference in Copenhagen and he invited us to go and talk about our storytelling work with business to his audiences. So today, Svend-Erik is a coach to leaders on how to incorporate storytelling effectively. He is a coach for oral storytellers, a teacher at Giant's Heart Storytelling School. I want to hear about that, Svend-Erik. And a licensed practitioner with Steve Denning Leadership Storytelling. His clients include Copenhagen Business School, Microsoft Denmark, the Danish government, the Smithsonian Institute, and more. And most recently, he has authored the book, Danish Folktales, a collection of 27 tales, as the book says, that grew out of the sprawling flatlands, the oozing fjords, the dark forests, and the waves that crash on the shores of Denmark. Again, welcome to Unlocked, Svend-Erik.
Thank you, Madeline. Yeah, I remember those days in Golden Fleece with pleasure. And it's always a big smile when I talk about it. It was great to go to Washington. And then when I invited you to come to Copenhagen, it was great to see all the fun that we shared. It was a good time.
I remember one time when there was a technical difficulty and I was furious because it wasn't working right. And I could see this worried look on your face, like, what is she going to do to the audience? Well, as soon as the audience came in and everything was fixed, I turned into my usual happy self. And I could see the relief on your face.
Yeah, I remember that. I wasn't sort of used to be organizer, and suddenly I was sort of it's actually my mistake now. So suddenly I was sort of worried about everything, but you handle it like you do a lot, Madeline, with a big smile and with a big heart. That's what you did.
Oh, thank you. It was fun. It was really fun. Well, I asked Ed and beforehand if he thought we should begin with a storytelling. And he agreed with me that we should have a story from Svend-Erik. So get to know him, that European approach, because we often think in America, we think of the stories that come out of Appalachia, whereas it's a little different in Europe. So Svend-Erik, would you mind telling a little story?
I will tell a story. It's all about the landscape of Denmark, this flat landscape. And there once was an old man who had some acres, and there was a forest. In that forest, there were deers, and that was the only thing that was of any value in his land. So when he was about to die, his oldest son came to him and said, Father, what's going to happen to that forest? And the old man said, I was thinking that you should have the tall trees and the low trees. Oh, said the oldest brother, that all the trees in the forest. I'm going to get the whole forest. And the middle brother came and asked, Father, when you're going to die, who's going to inherit the forest? I was thinking that you could have the thin trees and the big trees. So the white trees. Oh, the fin, and oh yeah, but that was all the trees in the forest. So he was very happy when he left the old man. Then the youngest brother came and held his father's hand and talked a little bit, and then he said, "What happened to the forest when you die, father?" Well, I was thinking that you should have the straight trees and the bended trees. Oh, that's all the trees in the forest, thought the youngest son. So the old man died. They buried him. And then they met with a solicitor and they talked about what's going to happen with this forest. And the oldest brother said, I'm not going to have the whole forest because Dad said that I should have the small trees and there's big trees. Yeah, but he's told me that I should have the thin trees and the thick trees. Yes, said the youngest brother, but he said that I should have all the bended trees and the straight trees. And they started arguing, and the solicitor said, Stop, stop. Please, hold on. What we're going to do is we're going to dig up your father, and we're going to tie him to a tree, and then you're going to move away a little, and I will hand you 3 guns, and then you will shoot at your father. The one who's closest to his heart will win the forest. And the 3 brothers went off, and then the 2 oldest brothers started sort of aiming at the father and sort of, I'm going to hit straight at the heart. But the younger brother stood there with his gun and said, I can't do it. I'm sorry. Solicitor, please, I can't do this. Here's the gun. Let one of the other have the forest because I can't shoot my father, even though he's dead. I know he's dead, but I loved him when he was alive and can't just shoot at him. And the solicitor smiled and said, You, youngest brother, you hit the father right in the heart. You should have the forest.
Wow.
Wow. Ed, what's your thoughts on that?
I love that. First of all, that's
Yes,
a
yes.
wonderful story.
Thank you.
I'm thinking I have 2 children. I'm starting to think about the forest thing, but no, I love the. To me, it illustrates really the beauty of story. Why it has been so popular at a place like NASA. It gets to the heart, really, of truth, and you can learn so much. You can enjoy. I mean, I think I get very close when you started telling the story, and then I enjoying the how you build that up, and I can see the visuals of the environment of the forest, and then I'm wondering how is this going to turn out, and it turns out, I think, in a way that we would value so much, and in something that's that's a natural part of what we do as people. So I loved it. I love stories, and I loved your storytelling presence.
Mm. You know, what came to my mind, although I did see the forest in my mind, then at the very end, as the youngest son says, I cannot, here, take the gun, give the forests to them. I was reminded of Solomon, who said, to cut the baby in half when the 2 mothers argued as to who was the mother. And of course, it was the real mother who gave up the child. And it was like, oh, it's the same story, told a different way.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for that. I'm always curious. How did you get into storytelling at all?
Oh, yeah, that was when I was a teacher. Oh, well, you can actually trace it back to when I was a child. My father and mother were sort of blue collar people. Not a lot of stories, not a lot of books in the house. And then there was a very big. We had a big grief, and I don't know, but when I was a young man, I was struggling expressing my fear, my anger, it was really unarticulated until I found theater. And suddenly I was out there and I could tell people that I was feeling all kinds of things, and they were listening. And then when I became a teacher at a high school in Denmark, that's a very special form of schools. There, every morning we met with the students, and at one point I realized that it wasn't enough to show another film. It wasn't enough to read out from a book. I needed to do something else. And the founder of the school, Grundtvig, always talks about the spoken word, the living spoken word. And I thought, I give it a go. I actually would try it out. So I told him about how we were watching television, my sister and me, through a grid in the very early 60s, black and white little TV.
Yeah.
And as we were sort of fighting about how to watch this TV, because we weren't allowed, my mother and father said, this is not a film for you. And then we started arguing, and suddenly the whole thing collapsed because my father and mother discovered that we were seeing this film. And when I finished that, I noticed that my students were different. They were sort of they were sitting a little bit like, what's that all about? What's she doing here? But when I really felt that I have grabbed something that has been my life ever since for the last 30 years, was when we came down and had our dinner. Every time at 12, we've all met at the big dinner hall there, and we were sitting and we were talking, the teachers, and suddenly I heard behind me somebody was retelling my story. And I was like, what on earth? It was very different. It was her version of my story. It wasn't my story at all, but she retold it in ways that she had seen it. And I just wondered, there's something here. There's something here. There's something that's strong and powerful that connects me with them immediately. That never happened when we had this book or film, whatever. It was always when they then met, there was just what is the information that is needed to have a daily life, but not what they have seen with the film or whatever. But from that moment off, I've been asking myself, what is it? What is it a story can do that you can't get from reading out from a book, showing a film? And the more I see it, I think that Grundtvig again is the one that brings in what is the key word of storytelling, and that's uh, not really translatable. It's Wechselwirkung. In German, it's Wechselwirkung. I don't know, it's interaction that's not really sort of covered, but it's really based on that when you tell a story, you are depending, you can feel the presence of the others. Even though it's online here, I could see that your face were, and that made me go in another way. And it's such a it's like we are two parts of one organism, and we just move together when a storyteller tell a story to listeners.
I'm sitting here really struck by what you just said. The fact that we almost become one. That's what you meant by one organism. That's fascinating. Ed, was that your experience when you were using story at NASA?
Yeah, absolutely. I identify with one of the things that Eric, you said. You learned about story by being a teacher. So I was at NASA in the early 80s studying leadership. Someone thought I knew something because after the Challenger space shuttle disaster, I was brought to Washington to basically create a learning academy for how do we create consistent program project excellence. And when I got there, I was in my late 20s. How do you do that? How do you create project excellence for people who had gone to the moon, right, in the previous mission? I had no idea. I kept reading books. And I remember working for my first boss, Frank, Hoban, who looked at me and says, "You're not going to get it that way." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're reading all these books. It's not going to teach you how to teach NASA how to do it." And what I started doing is I started finding people who were considered at the time excellent at managing projects. The first person that I think I asked to talk was an individual named Jerry Madden. Jerry at the time was known as one of the best project leaders at NASA, at Goddard. And he agreed to come to do a class to talk for a couple of hours. But Jerry was he was there. He was a little eccentric, but he kind of knew what he wanted. He said, "I will not wear a jacket. I won't wear a tie. I will not use slides." He says, "I'm just going to tell you stories."
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to make of it, but I said, he's this great project manager. I said, you can come in on an elephant if you want, Jared. Go up, do your thing. And I figured I'd figure it out from there. And he said, I've been asked to talk to you about what it takes to be successful in a NASA project. And he then told the story, which captured my attention and everyone else's. Short story. And by the end of it, he basically looked at me and he looked at me and he says, "That's what leadership in a project is." And I then at that second realized we were onto something. You got 60 people, you got 60 scientists, engineers, project people from NASA in a room, and they're mesmerized. And at the end of that, they're able to talk about what success looks like and how to do it. And so we, so the use of story was out of a function of how do you teach people something that's very intangible, and how do you get people in the same place where they can jump off of a starting point? So that was the background, where I started seeing the just sheer joy of and the power of stories.
The wonder of it is that the story itself contains things that are never not actually verbalized, but it's within the story. And there are things often that you don't talk about. As you say, it's hard to articulate, and yet the story carries that. Um, yeah,
I also think it could, and one of the things when I was looking at your both of your wonderful faces, but when you were telling the story, Svend-Erik, I look at you have the face of somebody who can tell stories, and stories don't have to be 100% right. Matter of fact, I think there's a leeway to kind of play with them and to take them. And the point is, and as you'd always say this, it's about what are we understanding and learning from this stuff, how we take it. And so I think the thing that people love about stories, we're not being tested on getting everything exactly a certain way. There's a beauty of telling a story a little bit different and interpreting it a different way. And so I think it's a wonderful way of just having fun. And again, I could be looking at Svend-Erik and say, "Oh, I wonder if this is this the same way he does it when he's talking to folks from Edinburgh, or is it a little bit different?" And that's fun to me. That's how we learn as humans.
yeah.
And when I teach people telling stories, I always say there's only one way to tell a story. Remember that. There's only one way. You can only do it one way. And people go like, what? Am I now going to be sort of have a list of things? And I always say, smile your way that time with this audience. That's the only way you can do it. That's your way. And you know how it is. You get up there and you find your way, because every one of us, we're different and we have a different approach and we have a different style and we have a different way of reaching out to people. There are people who love to tell a joke, just to open the heart. One of my masters were Dario Fo from Italy. Dario Fo, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's absolutely fantastic. And he always said that the audience is they are the conductor of me as an orchestra. So they conduct you how to tell that story. But then he also said, but take care, because it's a wild flock of horses, and they will take you out of everywhere if you don't hold them sort of in a grip. So it's kind of a
Yeah.
balance between the two, that they totally control you as a teller in the way that you do it. You meet them, the audience, and there. But if you lose them, if you suddenly sort of find your way that you're out of balance, or you tell too much, or you get too detailed, or whatever it is, they just drift off.
Yeah.
And today it's different. I mean, it's harder today. In the
Yeah.
moment you drift off, you have this kind of
Yeah.
this is a dangerous. You just get, then
Yeah.
they're off and away into their mobile phones or whatever they do.
It's often heard. I have often heard that the audience listens the story out of the storyteller. Different way to say it. But you know, what that calls to mind is that you wrote a book of folk tales. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, I wonder how somebody else would tell the story of the Father's heart. You know, how would I tell it? Would I tell it like Svend-Erik? And now I have permission to tell it exactly as at that moment. So, but I want to know what stimulated you to make this happen, because it's not always easy to find all the tales and to make them, put them in a book that people can really absorb. They're different and they serve a different role. So tell me about that.
Well, it's basically 30 years of storytelling that's in that book. I mean, I do different kind of stories. I do when I perform. So I do personal stories from my own life. I
Mm-hmm.
tell about how it was to grow up in a suburban town in Glostrup and have some of the people that I grew up with there became very sort of these bad guys with Hells Angels on the back or whatever it was. So I can tell about how it was to be in a community of blue collar people, and people like that because it's so strange. It's so really different from the world that it's today. And then I tell stories that I created myself. So what I say is that I do them in the workshop, and that means that I walk in the forest. That's that's what I if I have to learn a story, if I have to find a story, I go out somewhere where I know my way. I don't have to think. And today it's easier because in the old days when I was talking to myself, people were quite suspicious. Why is he walking around talking to himself? Everybody's talking to themselves nowadays. You just have something in your ears and you go
Right.
around. Yeah. Oh, he's just talking to his mobile phone. I'm not. I'm telling a story. I'm trying to figure out what to do with this story. And then there is these folk tales. And the folk tales I, I well, like I have a kind of a personal relationship to each one of them. And just to give an example, is my daughter, who was at the time 6 years old, I think 5 or 6 years old, came home from the library. We were driving in a car, and we wanted to go and see television. It was always at 6 o'clock. There was this child for children. So it was a December day. So we were coming home quarter 2 or something like that. So it really fitted perfectly. And in the moment she stepped out, she noted it was dark and there were stars in the sky there. And she said, "Which one of them is the seventh star for?" And I was like, I mean, if you have to see that, you have to go into the darkness. So we went into the garden where there was totally darkness there. And that's quite an experience for anyone to stand with a little girl of 5, just holding hands, looking up in the stars, trying to figure out where are these? You call them Pleiades, I think, these Orion belts and the Seven Sisters and all that. But we call it Seven Star. And that Seven Star is a story about a princess who's been saved by somebody who can build a boat and and sail the boat and listen and shoot and climb the mountain and steal her. So who should she then pick from these? It's not it's not fair, and everybody's crying. So God decides that they shall have to stay together for the rest of their lives. So he puts them up in the sky as stars. So we're standing there with that story in mind, talking about, oh yeah, that must be the princess. Oh, that must be the thief, because you can hardly see it. And every one of them had that kind of story. This is very unique because it was my daughter and everything. But I I've told these stories somewhere in Denmark and wherever. So I picked them from basically 30 years of experience with telling stories and listening to storytellers. That's a very good way of finding a good story. Is that, oh, that's a good one. I like that. And then you need to go and ask, can I tell this story? And they often say, yeah, if you
Yeah.
just tell that it's fine here. And if you look at the first four stories in the book, it's basically telling the story of how Denmark became Denmark, sort of what happened with the first Vikings and all of that. And that I think you can point out very much because I'm here in Edinburgh at the moment, in Edinburgh in Scotland, and they are very interested in this relationship between Scotland and the Vikings and the Scandinavia because they came here on the west coast of Scotland, and there's if you go to Shetland, they don't speak Gaelic; they speak Scandinavian.
Aha.
Because if you are in Shetland, that's an island on top of Scotland. It's closer to Bergen than it is down to Inverness.
Mm.
It takes longer to go to Inverness, that's the nearest town, than to just sail across to Norway. So the connection between Scandinavia and Scotland is huge, and it's great to find that interest. And I was like, oh, fascinating that they love it so much. So
Mm.
part of the book is also about that.
Now, you you also use storytelling when you work with leaders. So I wonder if you talk about that and how you see leaders using storytelling. Is there a business purpose?
Of I I make them make a tree. I often do that. I said, draw a tree. What's sort of how do you see your organization? It's and there's a canopy and there's the trunk and then there's the roots. And when we talk about storytelling, the way that I see it, it's very much that the foundation of this is the personal stories. What have you done? What what did you do in this organization? And I remember when I was in Novo, the big medicine company of Denmark, Novo Nordisk, there was this guy who told about the first day of work, and he really was having all this, he was well equipped with a tie and a white shirt and a jacket and everything. And he came into the bus where they were sitting all these engineers from all whatever bioanalytics from Novo, and none of them had anything that looked like that. They were all sort of casual wearing, and he was like, "Oh, you're new in your job. Yes, I'm new in my job. Tomorrow I will. I know my dress code." And that's little story from him. It was really important for him to tell that that's how I learned to become part of the tribe, how I became part of Novo. So that's sort of the what you don't see, the roots underneath, but the trunk is very much the we stories. The we stories that's often, if you look at a lot of these stories that you find in the book, that's very much this home challenge and new home. That's a pattern of a lot of fairy tales. A home where you say once upon a time there was a king and a queen and they had a daughter. Oh, this is not gonna last. There's something bad going on here. Something will happen, and she just have to do whatever she has to do. And of course, in the end, in the middle there, there's a big sort of transformation very often. I mean, Snow White, she actually dies. That is in a fairy tale, not the end of anything. It's a transformation. She transforms into something, and there's a helper. Somebody helps her to become up where we have a better home in the end. So you have home, challenge, and new home, and new home is always better than the old one. So let people find out stories where the organization created some kind of a fairy tale like that. And then there's the springboard stories. The springboard stories from Steve Denning, the future stories of how you can tell a story that actually had happened already. So it's very much the IV and future I see like that's a leadership tool for me. But also some of the fairy tales that I use just to let them have that kind of a conversation around a story that brings something else in a group. when you tell a fairy tale and then you let them have that kind of a conversation. What did that mean for you? What could you see that mean for this group, and where can we go in the future? So there's different tools.
And I'm curious your thoughts on this.
Oh no, I think so. One of the things I know, I mean, I checked this out, that the best leaders at NASA, leaders of projects, systems engineers, very technical people, and project managers were storytellers. You have to be. Most of your life is not. It's not doing the things we think of. It's basically you're trying to sell an idea. You're trying to keep people convinced of an idea. You're trying to keep people from taking money from that idea to something else. So it's really creating stories, that do exactly what you just mentioned. What is it we're trying to build here? And what is it that's going to get the alignment in terms of all different people with different backgrounds and different connections? I'll give you an example. One of the things I mentioned was that at NASA, I think what helps NASA change more effectively than others is that NASA is a naturally storytelling environment. And the kind of, you speak to a NASA, project person, exactly, you say, tell me a story. They'll tell you one of two stories. They'll tell you of a success of a project that they're working, and they can do that in 10, 15 minutes, and then they'll stop and we'll let people discuss what did they identify with, what did they learn, and from that comes what are the things we keep doing to stay successful. The other type of story they'll tell, if they're comfortable, there's trust, there's a failure story. And those are very powerful because there's a problem there. There's, if you will, there's a witch that's giving you the apple and you're sick for a while. And what people in that room then will get into is, okay, I've dealt with these stories. How can we organize ourselves to deal successfully with them? So it's I think it's the best leaders, the best folks are just naturally good at storytelling because you have to communicate, you have to convince, but you have to bring people on board and keep them entertained and interested. And learning comes from that. So very, very powerful. And I like that notion of the tree, right? Because there are some stories that are below the ground. And in different ways, what I've said to groups, what are the things we're not talking about? But I think in the future, I'll say, what are the roots that we're not seeing? So it's very, very interesting.
I like that aspect of the roots as well, because oftentimes when I'm working with someone, I ask them to write personal stories from their life. I said, and I don't care whether it was from 5 minutes ago or from when you were five, I want you to explore an event in your life as a little story. And you're right, those are the root things that eventually form who you are. And that's one of the roles or one of the things I want them to do as they're working with me, is to get a deeper sense of who they are. And their personal stories are so powerful that way. But I love that metaphor of the root, because then it's always there, but it feeds. But then of course we have the trunk where all the nasty stuff happens.
It's an invitation too, right? One of the kinds of stories I like is where people turn them upside down. What's happened in the last 20 years is women started rewriting traditional fairy tale stories.
Mm-hmm.
Maria Tatar, I'm a big fan of her books, and she writes from the notion of heroines and how women are successful. And it's a different lesson, it's a different approach. And so stories are playful because people, and when you're telling a NASA story, you'll see people in the room and they'll have a smile on their face because they're going to change that story a little bit in a different way. But that leads to more ideas and more approaches. It really is a fascinating thing.
When I worked for Microsoft at one point in Denmark, Microsoft Denmark, and they have this meeting once a year, I think, where they just show PowerPoints for 3 days or something like that. Each one has 15 minutes to present whatever they're doing in these various part of the world. And a guy came up to me as I was part of the Microsoft team there, and he said, "You're gonna make me win." And I said, what do you mean? I'm going to tell a story. And then I said, okay, one thing I want to know is, do you have children? Yes, he said. Then you're going to explain to your wife that for the next half year, you're going to tell stories every night for your children. She's just going to have half a year where she's not going to be in the bedroom with these girls. You're just going to have them and tell a story, and a new story every night. Or if sometimes children actually likes to be told the same story
Yeah.
many, many, many times. But he was, for the half a year, he was telling stories to these kids, and he became quite good at telling stories. I was coaching him once or twice, and he was really, really was good. So he phoned me up when this conference had been done and everything. He called me up and said, I was only number 2 in content. And I said, well, yeah, and yeah, I won overall, but and he was like, what are you talking about? Well, because they were not used to that. They were not used to having a person standing in front of them telling a story. That was the first 5 minutes of his presentation. Was no PowerPoint, no nothing behind. He was there with them. Vulnerable? Yes, definitely vulnerable. But if you know your story well, and I always said to him, the only thing you can, always feel your toes. If you get nervous, wriggle a little with your toes, because if you can feel your feet, you're grounded. And the audience know when a storyteller is grounded. Because when you start getting nervous, you suddenly, and then you get up here, and then you get your high pitched voice, and then you said, and the audience goes, "What's going on? He's flying." I mean, he's leaving us, or she is. But that's a story I remember very clearly. How to really get this knowledge of these. This only way to tell a good story is to become storyteller. Tell
Yes.
stories. Just do it.
Yeah.
But what a great trick to just tell your children. And of course, if you don't have children, then you have to find a child, because a child will really be present to that story as long as you are present to the story. And that, of course, is what I'm hearing behind the scenes of what you're saying is you have to be there telling that story.
Yes.
Yeah, children are good audience. They leave you if they don't want to hear. they're not polite and sit there and, oh yes, oh, it's very interesting. They just leave you. Whatever they do, or maybe they start playing with something else. They just it's very clear what they do. Yeah.
Okay, I want to challenge you guys. Let's assume we're all 25. It's nice
I
for
like
you.
it.
And you're just starting your career. You know that storytelling is important. How should you develop that capability? And I think you've talked a little bit about this, Svend-Erik. But what should they be doing? What kind of story should they be looking for? How do they really develop it? And then how do they decide when to use story? Don't everybody speak at once.
No.
I'm here with 2 masters, so I was going to let Svend-Erik go first, and then I'll.
Okay.
Ooh, but I mean, well, I often say to people that are young, I mean, I can't tell a good story, but then I ask them, have you been in love? Yeah, I've been in love. What did you do? Yeah, I tried to make that other person in love with me. How did you do that? Well, at one point I started telling stories. Yes, you started telling stories. I mean, love and storytelling is connected. I mean, that it is kind of a, you can't go in and tell a story if you hate it, or you really feel that you have something to sort of go against. So I often ask those people, but I'm not sure I know exactly what to do and point out if I was 25 and go for the right stories. I think that one of the thing is very clear, that it hurts to hit a bad story in the wrong place. It hurts in a different way that if you just go out and do a bad presentation with a lot of PowerPoints. It's kind of personal. And if you have that in mind, all right, it might not be fantastic the first time. It might not, and it might sort of you will go away and think, oh God, I'm never going to do this again. But then prepare them for that. Then you might have that kind of a, hey, this is going to take time.
You
And
know what that?
also,
Okay, go ahead.
just one thing is that storytelling is a strange in that sense that if you look at this language learning ladder, not learning ladder. You don't know that you don't know anything about it, and then you go up a little further on, and then you know that you're not good at it. Then you know that you are sort of okay at it, and then in the end, you become a master. Means that you're not aware, but you really do it. I don't know if you know that ladder. Yeah. The strange thing about storytelling is that you have to reinvent something. Because you were a master storyteller when you were 4 years old. Nobody has ever been 4 years without being totally fantastic at telling stories. They just do it, and you did it, at least the most of us. So go back to when you were 4. Yeah, try it out.
But you are right. We do have to. We do have to help ourselves get in touch with when we were really in touch with the world. Oftentimes, when I go out, your story about the sky, oftentimes I'll go out on my patio at night and I'll look up at the stars. And there are the moments when I feel like I'm actually part of the universe. That's what a child feels all the time. And if you can just recapture that just for a moment, and when you're telling that story, wow,
I think you tell
amazing
stories
what I.
about what you know. I think so. When I think about when I was 25, uh, I've always liked to tell stories because I felt more that I knew more about my story that I'm sharing than anybody else can. A lot of stories when I was 25, I told about growing up in Brooklyn. And when I was getting interviewed for Columbia, talking to all these brilliant people, what do I know? I don't know anything. But I could tell a story about Brooklyn, and I know they don't know anything about Brooklyn or where I grew up. So one of the things that I tell students or people who are young is don't try to tell somebody else's story that you don't have a connection. I've loved the stories that Madeline you've told about gardening, and I couldn't do that because people would know it doesn't know he was going there. But I can tell a story about Brooklyn. When I was starting at NASA, I can tell funny stories about what it's like to be at Columbia University and how do you take ideas to a place that needs to do work. So I think you should have fun with stories. And I tell people to have a book, have a journal, and I always keep down stories that I like, but also stories that I can identify with. That I think is really the starting point that we have fun telling the story, and therefore we own it, and therefore we can change it. Yeah,
Oh, I think you put your finger on it. Uh, to be, especially as a young person, to just begin telling the stories from your life, from your childhood or whatever, because those, as you tell that story, you are actually revealing a little piece of yourself.
right.
And that's a great way to build trust between yourself and the other person, to build that relationship. So if there's nothing else that you do as a 25-year-old, begin to get in touch with some of those stories from your early life, and feel comfortable to share them, or prepare yourself to share pieces of them. Yeah.
And I
Wow.
think the fairy tales, there are fairy tales that I love, that we love, and I think I read a lot of Hans Christian Andersen as a child, the Brothers Grimm. So I had stories that I always loved. And I was at a conference. So this is probably 20 years ago. I was in Australia, and I didn't expect it. It was about 1,000 people. It was an award ceremony for the best project leader in the world, in the country. And they said, "Would you come up, coming from NASA, and just say a few words, say anything?" And which is kind of an interesting request. So you're going to get up and just say nothing. You're just going to. So couldn't think of anything. And then I said to myself, what's some of my favorite fairy tales? And I said, I always loved the story of the Three Little Pigs. And I said, that's a project story because, the story goes is you have the pig that's demonized used cheap, straw and it fell apart. And the one that was successful used basically expensive equipment. And I said, all of you understand that that was a decision because if that wolf isn't there, then the hero of that story is the straw, the cheap version. So we got into that whole thing, and I had a good time, and they had a good time, and but it went back to a story that I loved and that I could play with and have fun with. So I think the beauty of these classic treasured fairy tales is that we identify with them, right? And we can learn from ourselves the stories we want to tell.
Fabulous. Well, believe it or not, we have just about run out of time, but I do, Svend-Erik, I want to give you just a moment. Is there anything further that you would like to share with our audience before we move on?
When you tell a story, just have that in mind that it's your way of telling it. It's not something that's right or wrong. You just have to do what you have to do with that story in that moment. That I still think is the most powerful advice I can give to anyone. You own the story. But when you own it, it's because you have to get it to everybody. It has to be everybody's. You have to share it right away, but take it in and then bring it out. That's the only way to go for a story, I think.
Oh, thank you so much, Svend-Erik. It's wonderful, wonderful to talk with you, and especially on this particular topic. And Ed, what a joy to have you back in the conversation.
Oh, a pleasure. Absolutely.
A pleasure, Madeline. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ed, for sharing all these wonderful thoughts about storytelling. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, wonderful to be a part of this.
Well, we're at that point, as you well know. It's ground.
Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself.
Circle of the Nine Muses, a storytelling field guide for innovators and meaning makers by David Hutchins. I met David Hutchins 13 years ago, and we had been placed together as part of an exercise at a conference where we were to tell each other a story. I had just lost my mother, and I was still grieving. So I don't really remember the exact story I told. What I do remember is the incredible empathy I felt from David as I told a story about my mother. Those stories and his empathy created a relationship and a friendship that has lasted ever since, even though we have spoken very little over the intervening years. What that means is that the moment of storytelling allowed us both to share something of ourselves in the safe environment created by such moments. Then I read his book, Circle of the Nine Muses. The introduction, called Dispatches from a World of Stories, read as if David was in the room with me. It begins with his story of visiting the Bluebird Cafe in Nashville for the first time. That's a place where songwriters and singers go to simply sing and play because that's what they love to do. And in his telling, David quotes some of the words from the song Holes in the Floor of Heaven, and he describes what happens to the audience in the telling of these words. And of course, those kinds of words in especially country music are really stories. The audience were in tears. As I turned the page, there were tears in my own eyes. And I'm suddenly struck by one sentence that David writes. I watch this room full of strangers who have become an instant community through shared experience, and I am overcome by the strong sensation that we are a single organism. I was stunned when Svend-Erik today used that same phrase, a single organism. Back to the book. In less than 2 pages, he helps you understand why storytelling can bind us together with an amazing power. And the rest of the book is a strong presentation guide of how storytelling can be used very specifically with examples and options and processes to entice anyone to try. Not just tell stories, but to work with others to achieve goals through the telling of stories. And by the time I read David's book, I had been immersed in the use of storytelling. I mean, I knew its structure, I knew its ability to create trust, I knew its power of finding meaning and inspiring action and much more. But as I read those first few pages, I knew each of these things suddenly at a much deeper level. He was just telling me a story, and he had my attention from beginning to end. His words reinforced why, in my work ever since, and why everyone has the potential to do the same. Circle of Nine Muses by David Hutchins. And by the way, this is the book. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and that you learned something new. If you'd like to explore what it means to build and nurture your confidence, decision-making, curiosity, resilience with me as a coach, schedule a conversation by sending me an email to madeline@madelineblair.com. And if you did learn something today, write it up in social media and say what you might do differently as a result. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the like button. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.